Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to this session, which I hope is going to be a fascinating account of some of the work that we do at the Sayyid Babar Ali School of Science and Engineering. I'm the Dean of the school. My name is Sabieh Anwar, and we have a panel of three distinguished scientists and technologists who are faculty members in our school. So I would like to introduce Dr. Syed Shahzad Hussain from the Department of Biology. He's our resident vaccines and viral expert. He's followed by Dr. Mirza, also from the Department of Biology. She's our resident expert in epidemiology, public health, and various infectious diseases. And we are pleased to have with us Dr. Maryam Mustafa from the Department of Computer Science. She works in the area of internet and communication technologies for development. So I would like to welcome all three of them. Thank you very much for joining us. And thanks to all the alumni who are with us in this session. We'll also be taking questions live. So you can post your questions and I'll forward them onward to the distinguished panelists. So let's start off with Syed Shahzad Hussain Saab. Shahzad Saab, we live in a new age. This is the age of the pandemic. So I wanted to ask if our country can ever make a vaccine. What does it cost? What are the underlying infrastructure that is needed? What kind of human resources needed for making a vaccine? Will we as a nation always continue to be asking for vaccines or importing vaccines from abroad? Can we make a contribution to the landscape, the global landscape of treating viral diseases? Ji Shahzad sir.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, thank you very much for taking me in the loop. And this is an honor for me to talk in this discussion, very interesting discussion. As far as this question is concerned, whether we will be able to make a vaccine or where we are standing, I think we will be able, we are capable. I think there is a little misperception about the role of universities and academia in the development of products or technology. I think all over the world, if you look, the fundamental role of academia at the university or the research institute is not to make product. Their role is to create knowledge to that level which can take industry or government institutes to translate into a marketable product which can be beneficial for the society. I think as far as our role is concerned, as a professor, as a scientist, as a researcher working in this field, we have sufficient capability. Actually, in the beginning, when this epidemic started, I was thinking that possibly the vaccine development against this virus is very difficult, because I was thinking from different angle, because this virus has some similarity with those viruses which are, for example, HIV and hepatitis C, which have been really big challenge in terms of developing vaccine. But in a year, it found out that it's not really that challenging. It's not really evolving that fast as other viruses, as I mentioned, are. And just conventional vaccine is even working. China has developed just a simple conventional using this old age technology, and which is working. Okay. And there is no rocket science behind that. Okay, the problem is in our country, in our society, there is no infrastructure of industry. There is no industry. There is no company. Okay, those industrialists, those pharmacological companies, the pharma companies, their primary aim is to just buy the raw material, mix them, and pack them and sell. That's it. They are not kind of motivated to take small risk to invest in terms of development, in terms of research. And there is a completely lack of link between university and industry. We have people, I think, which are capable of taking this challenge. We have sufficient knowledge of that, but only problem is there is a gap between where we create knowledge and how that knowledge is translated into product. We are definitely capable. If someone can take initiative today, it is possible. Not only this, I think I was thinking some like very advanced level, for example, the structure-based vaccine, which is really kind of difficult and state-of-the-art concept to develop vaccine. But it found out that even the simple vaccines, all these vaccines which are being developed, which are more conventional, although the RNA technology or DNA technology has been used, but the actual immunogen, it is not structure-based immunogen. It is just the complete protein of which is the surface protein of the virus. There is no structural modification. There is no structural presentation in that, which are generally challenging. So these technologies, I think synthesizing RNA is not really something to stay really rocket science. So it is possible, and if that gap can be filled, if some initiatives, some industry come up and maybe collaborate with the university, this is possible, and this is currently possible. This is not just a future. I mean, this type of vaccines can be developed very easily and in a very short period of time.
So just a follow-up question, Shahzad sir. थोड़ा सा आपने जो आप काम कर रहे हैं हेपेटाइटिस सी पर, और आपने रिसेंटली कोविड के हवाले से भी एक काम पब्लिश किया है. So could you tell us a little bit about your own efforts in vaccine design and what is meant by rational vaccine design or rational drug discovery?
Right. So rational mean, for example, I just give you the example of HIV and hepatitis C, for example. So these infections are the chronic infections which are there, globally prevalent for years and years and decades. And several vaccines have been developed which possibly work for a short period of time, and virus evolved over the time, and resistance came up, and those vaccines became ineffective. So this has been challenged for decades against these viruses. Then I think the scientific community started thinking from different angle that virus develop resistance by changing its surface. So one virus against which you are developing a vaccine, when the new virus, new generation of virus is in the population, it might have a different surface. It has mutations. Okay, it's called high variability. So on the basis of that variable sequences of these proteins, virus develop resistance and the vaccine become ineffective. But the rational concept is that the whole virus is not changing. Only maybe the more exposed part, the surface of the virus is changed over the time. But there are some part of the viruses which are highly conserved, which don't change, because virus require that those particular component to recognize its target cell, and those are highly conserved. So the rational vaccine design mean why not to design an immunogen which consists of those highly conserved component of the virus, and present to our immune system. If our immune system develop immunity or antibodies against those highly conserved region, the component of the virus, then those antibodies or that kind of vaccine would be effective for a very long period of time. So that is the fundamental principle of rational vaccine design. Yeah, so the same thing in terms of rational drug design is you look at atomic level the structural feature of the virus, and by looking at specific structures of the virus which have very important role in the replication cycle of the virus, you design drug just considering the structural feature of that component of the virus. This is called a rational drug design. But for that, you need really detailed understanding of the underlying mechanism, structure level or submolecular level or atomic level understanding of underlying mechanism to get that information, which would help to design a potential drug. So actually in our lab, I can maybe bring into the context what we are doing. I can just an example in case of hepatitis C, because this is a problem in Pakistan for years now. Although many drugs are now available in the market, which are very effective, but over the year we have seen that the virus is developing a resistance even against most effective drugs, and we can foresee that maybe after a few years their effectiveness will be decreasing over the time. And such I think there is a well-documented data that these drugs, more like very effective drugs, were available in 2015, now like over 6 years. And there is a well-documented data that in the whole world, less than 10% infected people have utilized, they had access to these drugs. Less than 10% people. So 90% people have been without the access of these drugs due to several reasons. To really cope with such infections, the only option is to develop a vaccine, a successful vaccine. So in terms of rational vaccine design, what we are trying to do to create knowledge to understand the virus is, for example, in collaboration with a few hospitals, including PKI, PKLI, and Shalimar hospitals, what we did in the last few years is that we made a pool of individuals. For example, there are around 30% individuals who can clear the virus without any medicine. They have something in their immunity that they overcome the infection. And 70% cases, the individual develop chronic infection, and which could be dangerous. So what we are trying to understand is we made a pool of those individuals with the help of these hospitals and colleagues from those hospitals, which had infections in future, and they have overcome the infection without any medication. Even most of those did not know that they were infected. So they cleared the virus. So what we are trying to do that to understand what is special in their immune system which help them to overcome the infection. If we can understand at some molecular level, for example, they might have some special type of antibodies which are targeted against very special region of the virus, and how they recognize that particular component of the virus, then that would be really a breakthrough knowledge that can help to synthesize some immunogen, some protein that could be used as a vaccine. Actually, we have very interesting results, and that paper is actually under review on that study. The first part of that project is we have some interesting results, but that is still kind of at initial stage.
Challenge Shahzad Sahab, I'll come back to you in the second round about some of the drug discovery and vaccine design that you've all tried to accomplish here at LUMS. That's in the second round. So I would like Dr. Shaper. Dr. Shaper, we know that you've been really involved with the government in different task forces, as well as your own research has really taken and it has accelerated in this in the wake of the global pandemic. So what have you learned about the COVID-19 in your research, and how does it apply to Pakistan?
So we have been working on lots of different fronts. So I'm going to start with my involvement with the government. So with the government, the first question was the smart lockdowns, and we wanted to know how to achieve those smart lockdowns. And I'm so glad that Pakistan, this was the first time that they started to bring all the resources together in order to answer these important questions. And our colleagues at UVAS developed this method of testing viruses in the sewage water. And they went around the whole Punjab and they tested several wastewater pumps to see or to identify places where they have a higher concentration of viruses. And then they identified those places as hotspots, and those were the places that were considered as places that might be able to transmit the infection. So the lockdowns were limited to those spaces or those places where they have higher rates of viral RNA coming out into the sewage. Now, this doesn't tell you a complete story, because it's very possible that those places were around industry where there are lots of people who show up to work, and that's why they had higher rates. But nonetheless, we had some leads into it, and we decided to lock down those areas. Second, I'm going to talk about my own research. So I think this pandemic is actually showing us, it's turning out to be sort of a mirror for us, and it's helping us identify the gaps that we have and how do we need to fill in those gaps. And it's not that we are lack on resources. We have several resources. I mean, we have a great resource sitting right in front of us, Dr. Maryam Mustafa. I mean, she works with computers and she works with technology, and that's exactly what we needed, what we call digital diplomacy, that we are going to harness this technique that we have, and we are going to disseminate the information regarding the pandemic, regarding the number of people dying, regarding our messages to prevent infections within the community, within a family, and across communities. So I think we have all the resources, but it was just a matter of placing those resources in the right places at the right time. And it took us a while, but we were able to finally deploy those resources in the right direction. So this was a public health part of this work. Now, speaking of my own research, I decided to look at the immunophenotype. So expanding on what Dr. Shahzad had said, so in order to build an effective vaccine, you need to first understand how the bacteria or the virus is invading the body, and then how the body is responding to that particular virus or that particular bacteria. So for that, we decided to look at the host response. And at the same time, we are also measuring the rate at which this virus is evolving. So we know that it is evolving. We have now 3 waves of infection, and in each wave, we are seeing a slightly different virus. And in order to understand this process of evolution and where this process of evolution is focused in the virus, we really need to understand the biology of the virus. So that's one side of my research. And the second part, I'm looking at the immune responses that the people are generating to the infection. Because if you look at the infection, there are various forms of infection. Some people are just simply colonized. They develop some symptoms for a very short period of time, and then they are perfectly fine. Whereas other people, they develop symptoms and then they have extended infection where they develop severe symptoms, and some of those symptoms are fatal as well, while the others require them to be hospitalized. Some of them are on oxygen, some of them are on ventilators, and we still don't know whether it's the virus that's causing this to happen or it is our own immune response that is resulting in this type of pathophysiology of infection. The third thing is that people are getting reinfected. Now, because we have very little information on the virus that is being isolated from the nasal swabs, we can't tell if they were reinfected with the same virus or they were reinfected with a different virus. But nonetheless, they are getting reinfected. So one, if they are getting reinfected with the same virus, then it means that the virus is doing something to our immune system that is not able to develop memory. So they don't recognize it when it comes around the second time. If they are getting infected with a different strain of virus, then it means that the antibodies that we develop in response to the first reaction or in response to the first infection are not cross-protecting against the second strain. So definitely the regions to which the antibodies are targeted are being mutated. But these are all my hypotheses that we are testing at the moment in the lab. And
so how do you test, Dr. Shaper? How do you test these hypotheses in the lab?
Okay, so what we are doing is we are taking the protein that is supposed to be highly immunogenic, and most of the antibodies are being produced. If you go to Chuptai lab or Shaukat Khanam, they test your blood for either spike protein or they test you for nucleic acid. So we have taken those two proteins and we are synthesizing overlapping fragments. And these proteins are coming from virus from the 3 waves. So if these viruses are different, then of course we are going to identify regions which are, yes, immunogenic, but at the same time are highly mutatable. And then we will take antibodies from people and we will see if these antibodies will react with this particular protein or not. And then within a strain, we will take antibodies from lots of different people and we'll try to react it with this protein. So we are going to measure cross-reactivity, and we are also going to measure well, this will not tell us about memory. For memory, we have to dig in a little bit deeper and take out a slightly different repertoire of cells, which are called B cells, and excite them with the same antigen and see if they recognize this antigen or not.
All right, so all of this is really exciting. So I just have a follow-up question about antibiotic resistance. Dr. Shahzad alluded to this problem. So how prevalent and how big a problem is antibiotic resistance in Pakistan, and what can we do to address this challenge?
Well, it's a global epidemic and it's everywhere. So there is no relief from antimicrobial resistance. Now, having said that, I think there are countries and there are nations that are putting in place a plan in order to reduce antimicrobial resistance. And now the question is, what are those plans? So let me give you a little bit background on antimicrobial resistance and how it arises. So bacteria and viruses evolve much faster than we do, and they don't require a specific stressor for them to evolve. If I go out to this Ruhi Nala and I collect some bacteria from here who had never seen any antibiotic, and if I expose them to certain antibiotics, I can bet my last dollar on it that some of these, or there will be a population of these bacteria that will be resistant to certain antibiotics. And that's because they have been evolving. And because they mush up their genome, they scramble their genome so frequently that by default, they are going to make a mutation that will give them resistance to an antibiotic. They are not doing it thoughtfully. It's not a thoughtful process. They're just scrambling their genome. And there are so many stressors out there that may be responsible for this. We don't know what exactly those stressors are, but one of the stressors that people think is responsible for it, in addition to natural mutation or natural evolution, is antibiotics. So we have antibiotics in the water, we have antibiotics in food, and we are constantly exposing these bacteria to a certain concentration of antibiotics, which we call minimum inhibitory concentration. So minimum inhibitory concentration is not going to kill it, but it will educate the bacteria. It will tell the bacteria that, see, if you come across something like this, you have to actually change yourself. Now, coming to the rates of antimicrobial resistance, Pakistan is ranked 4th in antimicrobial resistance in tuberculosis. I mean, among the 22 high burden countries, Pakistan ranks 4th in tuberculosis resistance. And there are 2 different types of resistance. There's drug resistance and there's multi-drug resistance. And we have patients with both the drug resistance and the multiple drug resistance. And it's very difficult to treat those patients. And just because they have persistent bacteremia, they continue to infect and transmit infections in communities. And this is unfortunate, but people are struggling. The National Tuberculosis Program is struggling with it. The same is true for pneumococcal infection. The same is true for E. coli or Enterobacteriaceae or bacteria that causes gut infections, that they are becoming resistant to a lot of 3rd generation antibiotics.
Right, thank you, Dr. Shaper. So moving on to Dr. Maryam Mustafa, She's a computer scientist, but the image of a computer scientist is someone who sits in front of the computer and is programming and writing computer codes. But Dr. Maryam Mustafa, your work also overlaps with social inclusion, digital inclusion, democracy to an extent, pluralism, reducing economic disparity. So what's the relationship between your work and all of these highly social constructs?
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's such an honor to be on this panel and to be speaking to alumni. That's exactly right. That's a great question. So my understanding of technology, I am a theoretical computer science. I'm purely trained in CS. I don't have any other degrees. I did my undergrad from LUMS in computer science. And since then, I've just been doing CS. But any technology that we create, it's not used in isolation. It's not, unlike sort of the early computers that were these massive machines that were put into labs that had very specialized engineers that were working with them. We now have technology that's so ubiquitous, right? It's in our homes, our kids use it, it's everywhere. And so an essential part then of creating technology, but also understanding what happens once technology is created, is the impact it has on individuals, on households, and on societies, right? And so my work then looks at how do you create technologies for specific populations, for specific tasks? How do you, and once that technology is out, what is it doing? How is it being used? How is it being leveraged? What is the impact that it's having? We are all, most of us, if not all of us, are on social media. We all use technologies without thinking about it. And it is fundamentally changing how societies function. And so that's kind of my work, to understand how that shift is happening, where we want that shift to go. How do you create technologies if you want that shift to happen in specific directions? And I focus particularly on healthcare, and I focus on mental health. I focus on digital financial inclusion, sort of the gender inequities and inequalities that exist within societies. Can you use tech to fill in the gaps, whether it's information gaps or gaps of resources, access to particular healthcare? How do you design tech to fill those gaps?
All right. So are there any specific examples that you would like to shed light on?
So a lot of my work in Pakistan actually has focused on the gender inequities. Now, while ICTs, information communication technologies, in the global South in general, they're are increasingly being used to enable economic growth, employment, empowerment, all sorts of lovely things, right? But there's also this increasing understanding that technologies are not gender neutral, right? So that has, for very, very long, that has sort of been the understanding that you just create a technology and it is equally accessible by everybody. Now we know that not to be true, right? Technologies are not gender neutral, and there are different sort of properties of affordances in the way they're designed that restrict access by other populations, right? For Pakistan particularly, there is this gender gap report that's put out every year. Pakistan is in the last third position, like the last spot in the 2020 Gender Gap Index. And that basically just means that Pakistan actually, out of 153 countries, Pakistan does the worst when it comes to gender equality, right? And this is not looking at gender equality in sort of abstract terms. This is looking at it in very concrete terms, like economic opportunities for employment. It is looking at the health and survival index. Political participation. So very concrete indexes that they've sort of measured and then come back and said, well, Pakistan out of 153 countries places 151. Only 6% of women in Pakistan have more than a secondary school education, right? And 78% have no education. Now, in a context like this, how do you create technologies for women where they're non-literate, they're digitally completely non-literate, and then the privacy concerns in Pakistan are very, very unique, right? So for example, one of the earlier projects that we did in 2019 was to look at digital financial inclusion, right? And now this is a really big problem. The size of the financially excluded population in the world is at 2 billion. And Pakistan is on the list of 7 countries that constitute half of the unbanked population around the world. And even worse, less than 5% of women in Pakistan are included in the formal financial sector. And if you compare this with South Asia's average in general, that's 37%, right? So only 5% in Pakistan, whereas in South Asia, our neighboring countries, it's 37%, and that's a big gap. And so how do you then try to think about financial inclusion for women in Pakistan? Traditional access barriers, it's that, banks are not everywhere. Physical banking infrastructure is not so widespread. It requires a certain amount of literacy for you to go and open a bank account. It requires mobility, right? You need to leave your house and you need to go to a bank, and then you need to sit down and open an account. And those are all barriers for women to access formal financial structures. And so we said, well, is there a way technology can help? And one of the things that's being pushed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, by other organizations as well, is digital financial services, right? Digital financial services has become sort of the golden goose for financial inclusion. And we also actually had a grant from them to look at this. Well, how do you use DFS to facilitate financial inclusion for women in Pakistan? And we did this study where we looked at micro entrepreneurs. We went through a Huwat's network and we looked at women who had gotten MFI loans. And we particularly looked at these women because we figured कि एक टिपिंग पॉइंट होगा जहां पर अगर आप औरतों को टेक्नोलॉजी प्रोवाइड कर दोगे, उनके पास डिस्पोजेबल इनकम इतनी है, वो थोड़ी सी एजेंसी भी है, थोड़ी सी इंडिपेंडेंस भी है, अपने बिजनेसेस चला रही हैं. So these women it should be relatively easier to get them to adopt digital financial technologies, right? Or DFS, and DFS, let me just explain for those who are not aware, they're like your Jazz Cash, Easy Pesa, mobile wallets, right? And so we said, well, in technologies ki wajah se, you no longer have to leave your house. You're not relying on a bank. Extensive documentation ki zarurat nahi hai. It's not necessary for there to be a branch of a bank in your area. And so it sort of bypasses all of these constraints. And so, this is great. This is going to work out so well for getting these women onto a financial service. When we spoke to these women, and we spoke to women in 3 cities in Punjab, and we found that it's not that these women were not aware. These women were absolutely aware. And what we heard over and over again was, ठीक है, मैं Jazz Cash और Easy पैसा का wallet भी खोल लेती हूँ या मैं account खोल लेती हूँ, लेकिन क्या होगा? मैं जाऊँगी, मैं पैसे आज डलवाऊँगी, कल मैं जाकर फिर निकलवा लाऊँगी, फिर मैं जाऊँगी, फिर मैं निकलवाऊँगी, मैं यही करती रहूँगी. There is nothing that these services are offering me that work for me, right? So now, if you're telling me that this mobile wallet has a plan for me to buy a house, if they have a plan for me कि मैं अपनी 4 साल की बेटी का जहेज इकट्ठा करना शुरू कर दूं ताकि जब वो 20 साल की हो, I have enough to get her married, right? If you're telling me that this service is going to help me expand my business, I am on it, right? I will use it. I am happy to sort of invest in internet bandwidth to do it, whatever it takes. But what is it currently doing? And that's, I think, a fundamental problem when it comes to technologies that are deployed in Pakistan. It's like this Western model of what has worked in other countries. You import it, and then you expect your population to adopt it, right? The other big problem with the way digital financial services and these products currently work is they're reliant on this idea of privacy that is a very Western concept, right? This idea कि आपका एक phone है, वो आपका है, आपने उसको lock किया, सिर्फ आपने उसको use करना है. That's not how phones are used in a Pakistani context, right? So most women have access to a shared phone, right? अब वो अपने businesses WhatsApp पर चला रही हैं, बस लेकिन वो WhatsApp उनका husband भी share कर रहे हैं, उनके adult children हैं, वो भी share कर रहे हैं. It is not their phone, right? A lot of the women we spoke to, they were using informal mechanisms of savings, right? तो उन्होंने जो हम लोग colloquially जिसको committee कहते हैं, उन्होंने committee डाली हुई है, right? Which is formally called a ROSCA. अब वो कमिटीज छुपाकर अपने हस्बैंड से डाल रही हैं बिकॉज दे वांट टू सेव, ताकि वो घर में एक नया कमरा डाल लें, वो एक फ्रिज ले लें, वो एक टीवी ले लें, राइट? वो उनका इनफॉर्मल मैकेनिज्म है कमिटियां डालना. अब वो हस्बैंड से और इन लॉ से छुपाकर डालेंगे. Once you digitize this, it's no longer hidden. Now you're making it transparent, right? And then this idea of all of your current DFS implementations, they are tied to one SIM, one phone, right? So then how is that going to work on a shared phone? How is this going to work on a phone where your husband, your in-laws, everybody has access to the phone? So these are some of the things that we're sort of thinking through. We're trying to understand how do you create these technologies that cater to women in Pakistan, that cater to a very, very different model of how agency works, how privacy works in Pakistan.
We're really hopeful that your work can empower half of our population. So even if my mother and my wife would like to go and open a bank account, I think they can't do it without having to show them my payslip. So I think a lot of us can relate to what you're mentioning here. So there's also a question some of Mr. Sajawal Khan has asked, and that's about how computer science and data science can help in the current pandemic. And computer scientists alongside health informaticians and health scientists and biologists and vaccine discoverers also play a role.
Yeah, I think one of the big things with the pandemic that's come up in my own work, in the work of my colleagues, in my own work particularly, the one thing that's come up is that without access to digital technologies, sort of COVID has sort of amplified what happens when you don't have access to digital technologies, right? And so that the women who were not online, they were particularly hit harder. They couldn't shift their businesses online. They couldn't start selling and taking orders online. So they had a much harder time adapting to the way societies have shifted post-pandemic. I think the second big thing has been misinformation around COVID, right? And how do you tackle that? And that's a particularly challenging problem because, I mean, there's been a lot of work in the West on misinformation around Twitter and social media, and those are fairly open platforms. So it's easy to sort of start gathering lots and lots and lots of data and build models and try to identify कि क्या misinformation है, क्या नहीं. हमारे context में a lot of what's being spread around is over WhatsApp. And that's a closed encrypted platform. So unless we have access to data, I have a group of students who are working with 74 WhatsApp groups, right? And trying to look at that data, scraping that data, trying to understand what form it takes, right? And one of the things that, again, in a Pakistani context that we've come up against is that a lot of the misinformation around COVID vaccines, around specific treatments for COVID, they're coupled with religious knowledge. And that makes it really, really hard to counter just because in a Pakistani context, if you tell people this is what the Hadith says or this is what the Quran says, and then you have something that's clearly incorrect, people will believe it. And then how do you counteract that becomes really, really challenging, right? And because WhatsApp functions the way it does, it's very hard to figure out कि एक thread अगर एक stream चल रही है आपकी misinformation की जो बार-बार forward हो रही है, वो patient zero कहाँ था, वो कहाँ से शुरू? Because I mean, Twitter mein to you can track this. WhatsApp is a closed platform and it's really hard to track that. So, I mean, there are quite a few groups at LUMS that are trying to figure this out and trying to understand, you know, the form misinformation takes, how it spreads, particularly over WhatsApp, and then what are the best ways to counteract this?
All right, thank you. So I would like to move on to Dr. Shahzad. शहजाद आपसे पूछना चाह रहे हैं, अगर आपसे कहा जाए कि लम्स में आपकी जो सबसे इम्पैक्टफुल रिसर्च क्या थी, और अगर आपको 5 साल दिए जाएं मजीद और 5 साल का वक्त हो और आपने कुछ अपने ख्वाब पूरे करने हैं, तो वो क्या ख्वाब होंगे? क्या ब्रेक थ्रूज आप देख रहे हैं अपने लिए?
Okay, let me give you an example. Maybe a little more broad spectrum. I was talking to my friend who is a faculty somewhere in Boston a few days ago. And I was showing him during this discussion that little disappointment that I'm here and what I was thinking that I would be doing, I could not achieve even the 50% of those things in terms of research and all those things due to several, the challenges and kind of those things. And that, my friend, actually made me realize a different angle, which I had not realized. And he told me that you are completely wrong. You might not have produced those level of research papers or those level of understanding which you are doing possibly when you are not in Pakistan, you are abroad. But what you have contributed and which you are contributing is look at how many trained students, alumni, which came out from your lab and where they are. If your lab student who trained in your lab is sitting in MIT or sitting in Yale or sitting in University of Heidelberg or different, and some of those have already like some jobs and they have completed their PhDs doing postdoc. And when those people think that what they learned when they were at LUMS and your contribution, they reminded that's one like a big aspect of your contribution. Okay, so that's one thing. I think that was kind of a very inspiring angle of thinking, which he made me realize that, yeah, that is something we should be happy, which we generally don't think about. We just get disappointed that our research is not moving that fast as we were expecting. Okay, so that is one angle that we, as a researcher, as a teacher, we should make our best effort to impart knowledge, to create motivation in this young generation, and train them with really positive attitude. They should have, motivation is really big thing. If you have a kind of motivation, they want to achieve something which is second to no one, that would possibly lead them to some level. So training that young generation is a kind of achievement, maybe indirect achievement. If they achieve something, to produce something, that is your indirect achievement. So this is one angle. As far as your question, the direct question is concerned, related to research, that what we are doing is, so there are two main areas on which we are working. The one is to understand, to create knowledge, which possibly would lead to develop vaccines against viruses, not just coronavirus. This is, I mean, this is just a pandemic and everyone is talking about coronavirus, but we need to think maybe in the more broad spectrum. Okay, for example, hepatitis C is a bigger challenge. I think 7-8% population, and we have seen, we did some analysis with help of Punjab government, that in some areas, in small towns, we have seen up to 50% population who were exposed with hepatitis. In some small villages, we have seen like 50% people were infected, and many of those were even did not know that they are infected. So this is kind of a challenge. And I think we are trying to understand infections, including hepatitis C, and also including coronavirus, because this is a challenge for everyone nowadays. In terms of creating knowledge to that level, that would possibly lead to the development of a successful vaccine. For example, hepatitis C in this particular case. And I think if I look, I mean, we cannot really claim that we will have that product in 5 years, but I think I am confident that the way we have worked in last few years to set up, to make some foundation of basic knowledge on which we can basically move to the next level, to create that kind of knowledge that would lead to develop vaccine, at least against hepatitis C. As far as some example that we have succeeded, I can give example in terms of development of some antiviral molecules. Some innovative aspect which we are actually using is we are trying to target some part of the viruses or some feature of the viruses which are common among different viruses. For example, if we take example of hepatitis C virus, HIV, and coronavirus, there is one common feature in these three viruses, that is the presence of specific carbohydrates on their surface, which they cleverly incorporate using human machinery. Those are human carbohydrates, but these viruses, they are smart enough, they incorporate using our cellular machinery on their surface so that they can dodge our immune system. So this is common feature in all these three types of viruses. And one innovative kind of approach which we are using is that we design or identify molecules which can target these carbohydrates. We generally use the word glycans when they are attached to some proteins. So in that context, recently we designed a protein, we engineered a protein, a specific protein, considering that it should bind to the glycans of the virus. And after designing on the basis of some hypotheses, then we tested the effect of that lectin on hepatitis C and HIV, and we found that that molecule was really potently inhibiting both of these viruses. Okay, so this was kind of a preliminary discovery that we designed a molecule, but now moving forward, possibly, because when you develop a drug, there are several things. It's not just a molecule is inhibiting viral infection that is going to be drug, because there are several things. It's the side effects, it's the immunogenic effects, and several other things have to be looked and optimized. So we are, I think, kind of next stage, that how we can further modify that type of molecule that can be used as a drug, and some company can take it and develop into a marketable drug. So this is kind of one of the, I think, very successful story of the research in our lab. Moreover, we are trying our best. In the class, in my sophomore level class, I generally tells a story to my students. If you allow me, I can tell in a minute. That is the story of this antibiotic, which is called penicillin. And if we relate to some of your questions, this antibiotic resistance, it is related to that. So this antibiotic was developed long ago, maybe 50 years ago, or even 70 years ago. And this particular antibiotic basically inhibit an enzyme which is responsible to make cell wall of the bacteria. But over time, over a few decades, due to the evolution, the bacteria developed another enzyme, which was, its name was Beta-Lactamase. And that enzyme used to just degrade the antibiotic, and antibiotic was not able to bind to its target, and that is drug resistance. Now, all those antibiotics containing that lectin, we call lectin containing antibiotic, which is penicillin class, they got ineffective, completely ineffective. Okay, so bacteria succeeded. Then there was now the human term, okay, how to deal with that. Then over the time, the science developed an inhibitor of beta-lactamase enzyme. That bacterial enzyme, which was used by bacteria to develop a resistance. So the science developed inhibitor of that, and then mixed with that ineffective antibiotic, and antibiotic become effective. For example, there used to be an antibiotic, its name was ampicillin, amoxicillin, which was effective, but later it became completely ineffective. Okay. But that when an inhibitor, I think the small molecule inhibitor of beta-lactamase, when it was mixed with amoxicillin, its name was clavulanic acid. And that made a new drug, which is still being used. Its name is Augmentin. So Augmentin is not a new drug, basically, which is being used for last decade, possibly. It is old amoxicillin, which is a mixture of amoxicillin, but the inhibitor of that beta-lactamase inhibitor. Okay, now it's possibly bacteria's turn, that how it cope with that strategy and develop resistance against this particular combination. Bottom line here, what I want to tell is there is a continuous ongoing battle between human and these pathogens. There is an ongoing, never-ending battle between bacteria and human. There is a never-ending battle between human and viruses. There is a just turn at some point. One is above, and taking lead, and other is being defeated, and maybe after some time point, the human is taking lead over that particular pathogen. But this is never ending. What we should do is we should continue our effort to understand these infections, to understand those emerging changes, those emerging knowledge, to create more knowledge so that we can be successful in this ongoing battle, which would possibly be never ending. Okay.
Hope, Shahzad sir, we can ultimately win this battle, inshallah, like many battles that we've won in the past, until and unless new enemies appear with new arsenal, and so that we have to change
So
our mechanisms
so our
again.
aim should be to develop, to keep developing new and new arsenal. If one arsenal fails, we just be ready for the next one and the next one and the next one. That's what.
So Dr. Shaper, I wanted to ask, you've had an illustrious career at the University of Texas, and we are lucky that you are now a part of LUMS for some years. What's been your most satisfying achievement in your laboratory here at the School of Science and Engineering? And what kind of mileposts do you see for yourselves? And what kind of big achievements do you envisage will happen in the few years to come?
All right, thank you so much, Sabieh. And I think I'm very fortunate to be part of the Pakistani system one more time. And it has given me an opportunity to translate some of my information or the knowledge that I had learned and gained in the United States to Pakistani platform. So, वैसे तो like in the words of Iqbal, Allah kare marhala shauq na hote, because I don't want to stop at any point. I think I have continued my efforts towards infectious diseases and chronic diseases, and I would like to continue to do that. But I do aspire to translate my information into real-time solutions. Like, I want to improve public health in Pakistan. I want to find a resolution from pneumonia. I mean, every 5th children die of pneumonia in Pakistan, although we have a vaccine, but the vaccine is only 60% effective. So I need to communicate this. We need to communicate as a university, as a school, as people who have information, communicate all of this information to the drug companies and let them know that, you know, one size doesn't fit all. They need to come up with solutions that are more pertinent to the problems that we have in Pakistan. And they need to understand, try to understand the origin of the pathogen in Pakistan. And maybe I can bring the burden of antimicrobial resistance down, or develop something that can help prevent tuberculosis, or at least reduce the incidence or the burden of tuberculosis in Pakistan. So I don't want to stay limited to my bench. I want to take all of this information and translate it into some sustainable, affordable solutions that can improve health of a common man in Pakistan. And we have a computational biologist, we have a virologist, I'm an immunologist, and LUMS is filled with people who are working on policies, on behavioral sciences. I hope that we can all put our heads together and work from a single platform, which is called LUMS, and try to improve the health, the economy, the different, I mean, wherever we can contribute. So right now, if you ask me a very personal thing that's very dear to me, I'm working on a pneumococcal vaccine, and unfortunately, we are finding that even though these kids are being vaccinated, but they're being infected by the same strain again, which means that the vaccine that was given to them is not effective. I would like to talk to people in industry and tell them that they need to look at the strain, the indigenous strains, and try to develop or maybe modify the current vaccine that they have so that it can prevent pneumonia in children in Pakistan. The second thing that I would really like to push forward is some changes in the healthcare system where they can make it mandatory for people with diabetes to have pneumonia vaccine, because pneumonia is the biggest killer of diabetic patients. They have a compromised immune system, they have a high bacterial burden, and most of the time the pneumonia disease end up in fatalities in diabetic patients. Then I would like to disseminate knowledge about the simple things related to health. talk about sexually transmitted infections, and maybe we can use the computational platform in order to do that, in order to disseminate that information. Nobody talks about gonorrhea. Nobody talks about chlamydia. People think HIV is, God forbid, some kind of a plague or something that has been imposed to us by God. So we need to move forward with that and educate our people. And I think if we don't do it today, this is never going to happen. So in short, I would really like to translate everything that I'm doing in the lab to improve the health of a common man.
May Allah give you wings to fly, and I hope you can achieve your ambitions. So
If only I can expand my shepherd, that will work.
Yes, yes, exactly. So probably the last question of the session, and that is for Dr. Maryam Mustafa. Dr. Maryam Mustafa, how do you think that your work, it's a similar question, your work in the digital realm can revolutionize how Pakistan can talk about its inclusion, about its diversity, about reducing gender inequality, about reducing economic disparity? Do you think that your work can really make a difference?
That's a great question. Also slightly loaded. Before I answer that, I mean, I love hearing Dr. Shaper, and I always think that she needs to figure out a way to clone herself. I think that would be great for Pakistan. Right? If Dr. Shaper can just make more of Dr. Shaper, that's what she needs to be working on. As far as my work, I think absolutely. I think technologies have so much, and this is what's so exciting about being in Pakistan, is that there's so much potential for creating mechanisms for inclusion, for diversity, for gender equity, right? To create platforms. I mean, if my big vision is to be able to have an open, accessible, affordable internet and mobile technology for everybody in the Pakistani context, right? I mostly work in Pakistan with women, but then there are other marginalized communities in Pakistan that have similar concerns and constraints, right? So for example, you know, similar to what Dr. Shaper said, Pakistan is in crisis constantly where health is concerned, right? I work in maternal health. In the maternal health space, Pakistan has a maternal mortality ratio of 178 deaths per 100,000 live births. And this is compared to a developed country average, which is just 12 deaths per 100,000, right? And a lot of this is preventable. Information just isn't there, right? So when I'm in the middle of a health crisis or somebody close to me is in the middle of a health crisis, it's really trivial for me to pick up my phone, to Google specific types of information. I have enough knowledge to know which types of information or which websites are accurate ones, and to follow that advice, right? The majority of the women in Pakistan, the majority of the population in general in Pakistan does not have that access, right? Phones are not created for them. The information is available in English. There's no voice-based Google, right? There's no voice-based technology where I can just use my voice in Urdu, ask a question, and I get the appropriate response. From my own work, I know that even the most low literate women, even the women who have no digital literacy, who have no formal education, when it comes to something that really matters to them, a lot of the times that ends up being their dramas and their soaps. They're fabulous at navigating YouTube. And YouTube is a fairly complex interface to navigate, right? But YouTube has this great feature of allowing you to search using your voice. And even in an Urdu, it'll show you approximately appropriate results, right? And so ideally, be able to create technologies, to be able to not just create technologies in my own lab, but to sort of have people really think about what they're creating and who they're creating for. So when you have these big fintechs and you have the State Bank, which has put up this really nice application, RAS, which is not really an app, it's just a way to do financial transactions. But to get people to really think about, well, how is this inclusive? Who does this exclude? Right? And that's never been asked when technologies have been created. Who does this exclude, and how do we include 50% of Pakistan's population? When you do your, when we were talking to the national incubation centers, we were being told that we don't have enough women in our cohorts. And, they're stumped as to why. I can tell you why. It's because you're expecting women to travel far from home, to dedicate a couple of hours to sit through workshops. They're not going to do it. They're time poor. But there's no, one thing that we're working on is how do you create virtual incubation spaces for women? All of the women that we spoke to who had gotten loans through Akuba had set up really successful micro enterprises, and they wanted to expand them. They just don't know how. And they're not going to go sit in a 3-4 hour workshop that a Hoover or CEDAUT or Kush or anybody is doing. They don't have, they have restrictions on mobility and they're time poor. So how do you create virtual incubation spaces for them, virtual trainings for them that they can do on demand, and it's in a way that they understand and they can directly sort of employ what they're learning to expand their businesses. So, I mean, those are some of the areas that I think have great potential.
All right, so I think to the viewers of this session, you can see how impassioned our faculty are and how deeply they think about the society and how eager they are to make an impact on the lives of the 230 million people that we have in this country. So as I said earlier, may God give them wings to fly. I would really like to thank all of the alumni who attended this session, all the other audiences. And at the end, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists, Dr. Shahzad Hassan, Dr. Mirza, Dr. Maryam Mustafa, for the valuable time that they've given to us. Thank you, everyone. Pakistan, Zindabad.
Thank you very much. Pakistan.